All right, so get ready, because today we are diving deep into some seriously heavy philosophical waters. We're tackling Johann Georg Hamann, an 18th century philosopher. And honestly, even prepping for this one, my brain felt like it was doing gymnastics.
Yeah, he doesn't exactly make for light reading, does he? What I find fascinating about Hamann is that he was such an outsider in the academic world, never held a university position, but still, his thinking ended up influencing some of the biggest names in philosophy, like Hegel and Kierkegaard. Even Goethe, as brilliant as he was, found Hamann a real challenge to understand.
Yeah, Goethe actually said that reading Hamann, you have to completely rule out what one normally means by understanding. Um, that's comforting. So how do we even begin to approach someone this dense?
Well, first, let's get rid of that image of the stuffy, professor. Hamann's life was anything but ordinary. Born into pretty humble circumstances, he had this wild period in London, followed by a profound religious conversion. That experience really shaped his entire outlook on life and philosophy.
Okay, so life experience feeding into philosophy, I can get behind that. But I'm still stuck on this whole decoding Hamann problem. His writing is, well, it's notoriously packed with allusions, irony, citations. It's like he was deliberately trying to make it difficult to understand.
He did, and there's a reason for that. Hamann was deeply skeptical of the Enlightenment's, obsession with pure reason. He believed that we can't separate thought from language, right? And language itself is inherently messy, subjective, rooted in experience. So his writing style is a reflection of that.
Oh, so he wasn't just being difficult for the sake of it. He was actually making a point about how we think. That's pretty clever, actually.
Precisely. He called his approach metacritique. Instead of simply critiquing specific ideas, he was critiquing the very act of critique, the assumptions that underlie how we even form arguments. Imagine, like, someone questioning not your opinion, but the entire framework that led you to that opinion.
Whoa. Yeah, okay, my brain is definitely doing those gymnastics now. So what Amen is saying is that because we think through language, which is always going to be subjected to some degree, there's actually no such thing as pure objective reason.
You got it. He didn't see reason as some kind of faculty we possess, but rather an act, something we do. And that act is always influenced by our individual context.
This is seriously making me rethink, like,
Well,
everything I thought I knew about philosophy. So if reason isn't this neutral tool, how do we even approach knowledge then?
Well, Hamann believed that knowledge is fundamentally relational. We understand ourselves through knowing others, and tradition plays a huge role in shaping our understanding. He also really emphasized the principle of the union of opposites, the idea that truth often emerges from the tension between contrasting ideas.
Hold on, the union of opposites. So he's actually saying contradictions are valuable. This guy's really turning things upside down. Can you give me like a concrete example of how this works in his philosophy?
Sure. One of his most intriguing and, let's face it, controversial works is his essay of a Sibyl on marriage. In it, he connects sexuality with theology, arguing that to really understand human intimacy, you have to view humanity as God's creation.
Whoa, sexuality and theology, that's not a connection I would have made. Is this like a common theme for him, linking these seemingly unrelated topics?
It's absolutely central to his thinking. He saw everything as interconnected, and he was never afraid to explore those connections, no matter how unconventional they might seem to others.
Okay, I'm starting to see how challenging, but also how insightful this guy could be. It's like he's forcing us to look at the world through this entirely different lens.
Exactly. He's dismantling all those neat and tidy categories we usually use to try to understand things, right? He's pushing us to embrace complexity and paradox.
So to even begin to understand him, man, we have to unlearn some of our own habits of thinking to approach knowledge in this more fluid and relational way. This is a seriously deep dive already, and we barely scratched the surface.
And this is where his critique of the Enlightenment really gets interesting, right? See, many Enlightenment thinkers saw reason as this universal objective faculty, almost like a superpower that could lead us to absolute truth.
Right, that whole age of reason thing, like if we just think hard enough, we can solve all the world's problems. Seems a bit simplistic, maybe.
Exactly. Hamann really saw the flaws in this kind of utopian thinking. He argued that reason as we actually use it is always shaped by language, experience, culture, all those messy subjective things that the Enlightenment kind of tried to sweep under the rug.
So it's not that he was anti-reason, he just had a more realistic, grounded view of what reason actually is.
Precisely. He was warning against what he called the purism of reason, this idea that we could somehow purify reason from all of our, subjective influences. He thought that kind of abstract reason was ultimately sterile and, to be honest, impossible.
Okay, I'm starting to see why he's considered such a tough read. He's not just presenting arguments, he's like dissecting the whole framework of how we think and reason. It's like metaphilosophy or something.
You got it. And this is where his emphasis on language becomes so crucial. For Hamann, language isn't just a tool for communication, it's the very foundation of thought itself. It's not that we have thoughts first and then put them into words. Words actually shape how we think.
So for him, there's no escaping the subjectivity of language.
Yay.
Even when we're trying to be objective, our very thoughts are already kind of colored by the words we use. That's a pretty radical idea.
It is, and it has huge implications for how we understand knowledge. If reason is always bound up with language and experience, then knowledge can never be absolute or objective in the way that some Enlightenment thinkers hoped.
So no view from nowhere, as some philosophers like to say. We're always coming from somewhere, with our own baggage, so to speak.
Exactly. And this brings us back to his concept of metacritique. He believed that philosophers often fall into the trap of what he called prosopopia, basically giving human qualities to abstract concepts.
So like taking something like reason and treating it as if it has a life of its own, separate from, us messy humans who are actually doing the reasoning.
That's it. And Hamann saw this as dangerous because it can lead us to overestimate the power of reason and forget that it's always a human activity prone to error and bias.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. He's critiquing not just specific ideas, but a whole way of thinking that really dominated the Enlightenment, this pursuit of absolute truth through pure reason. And he's offering an alternative, a more grounded, relational, and language-centered approach to philosophy.
That's a great summary. He believed that truth isn't something we discover out there. It's something we create through our interactions with the world, with each other, and that creation always happens within the framework of language.
Wow, this is really making me question my own assumptions about philosophy. It's so easy to get caught up in that search for universal truths, but Hamann reminds us that things are much more complex and messy than that.
And that messiness isn't something to be afraid of. In fact, he saw it as the source of real insight. His work is full of these unexpected connections, like linking sexuality and theology in his essay of a Sibyl on marriage.
Right, we talked about that earlier. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around how he brings those two things together.
Well, it's a complex essay, but one of the key themes is this idea that human sexuality actually reflects the divine. He uses the Christian concept of the Trinity to argue that the union of man and woman in lovemaking actually mirrors the relationship between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Okay, that's definitely not how I usually think about either sexuality or theology. But I'm starting to see how he's using these seemingly unrelated concepts to explore deeper questions about creation, relationships, and the nature of the divine.
Exactly. He's constantly pushing the boundaries, challenging us to see the interconnectedness of everything. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of his work, his relationship with Kant. They were contemporaries, even friends on some level, but they had very different approaches to philosophy.
Yeah, we mentioned Kant briefly. He was a big Enlightenment thinker, right? So how did those two very different minds interact? Was it like a clash of the titans or more of a respectful disagreement?
A bit of both, actually. They had a deep respect for each other's intellect, and Kant even helped Hamann out financially at one point. But philosophically, they were often at odds.
Okay, so where did their paths diverge?
One major point of contention was their view of language. As we've discussed, Hamann believed language is fundamental to thought. But Kant, at least in his early work, saw language as more of a tool for communicating pre-existing thoughts.
So for Kant, reason could operate on its own in this pure realm of abstract concepts. But for Hamann, language wasn't just an add-on. It was like the very air that reason breathed, the water it swam in.
Exactly. And this led to very different views on knowledge. Kant believed in the possibility of a priori knowledge, knowledge independent of experience. But for Hamann, all knowledge was rooted in experience, and that experience was always shaped by language.
So even though they were both brilliant minds, they had these fundamental differences in how they saw the world and the role of philosophy. It's amazing they could even have a conversation.
Well, they did more than converse. They debated, they challenged each other, and they probably learned from each other even if they never fully agreed. Their relationship is a great reminder that disagreement can be productive, even essential to intellectual growth.
All right, this has been a whirlwind tour of Hamann's world, and my head is definitely spinning. But I feel like we're getting closer to understanding what made him so unique and why his ideas are still relevant today.
He is definitely not an easy thinker to grasp, but the rewards are definitely worth the effort. He challenges us to rethink some of our most basic assumptions about how we think, how we know, and how we interact with the world.
And in a world that's, increasingly complex and fragmented, I think that's a challenge we need to take seriously.
I couldn't agree more. But before we get too deep into the implications of all of this, there's one more key aspect of Haman's thought we need to explore: his view of interpretation.
Right, we've been dancing around that idea all episode. He wasn't a fan of just handing people the answers, was he?
Not at all. He believed that interpretation was an active, creative process. And that's one reason his writing is so dense and challenging. He wanted to force his readers to engage, to wrestle with the ideas, to make their own meaning.
So it's not about finding the right interpretation, it's about the act of interpreting itself.
Precisely. He believed that true understanding requires engagement, passion, and a willingness to grapple with complexity and even contradiction.
And that makes me think about how we're approaching Haman right now. We're bringing our own perspectives, our own biases to the table, and we're trying to make sense of this incredibly challenging thinker.
And in doing so, we're demonstrating Haman's point. We're not just passively absorbing information, we're actively creating meaning through dialogue, interpretation, and engagement.
So in a way, we're living out his philosophy by having this conversation. That's pretty meta.
It is, and it highlights the enduring relevance of his ideas. He reminds us that the search for truth is not about finding easy answers, but about embracing the messy, complex, and often paradoxical nature of reality.
All right, I'm ready to embrace the mess. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from Haman's unconventional life to his challenging ideas about language, reason, and knowledge.
We've explored his critique of the Enlightenment, his emphasis on relationality, and his unique approach to interpretation. And I hope we've given our listener a good foundation for starting their own exploration of this fascinating and complex thinker.
We definitely have. But before we say goodbye, I want to leave our listener with one final thought-provoking question to ponder.
Oh, I like where this is going. Lay it on us.
If language truly shapes our thinking, as Hamann so passionately argued, how much of our own understanding is influenced by the words we use?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. It challenges us to pay attention to the language we use, to be aware of its power, and to recognize that our words are never neutral. They shape how we see the world, how we think, and how we relate to each other.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that question. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Johann Georg Hamann. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those thoughts flowing. Okay, so we've talked about how Hamann saw language as this almost foundational element of thought, but how did he actually think that worked? Did he have any specific theories about language itself?
He did, and this is where things get even more interesting, I think. Hamann was really fascinated by the relationship between language and reality, and he actually developed some pretty radical ideas about how they, interact. One of his key insights was that language isn't just a tool for representing the world, it actually shapes the world we experience.
Okay, so it's not just that we use words to describe things that are already there, but that the words themselves actually influence how we perceive those things.
Exactly. He believed that there's this deep connection between the structure of language and the structure of reality. And this connection isn't arbitrary or accidental, it's rooted in the very nature of human experience.
This reminds me of what we were talking about earlier with his idea of the union of opposites. Is there a connection there, do you think?
Absolutely. Hamann saw language as a key example of this principle. He argued that language itself is a kind of union of opposites. It's both subjective and objective, both individual and communal, both a product of our minds and a force that shapes our minds.
Okay, I'm following so far, but can you unpack that a little bit more? How can language be both subjective and objective at the same time?
Well, think about it this way. Each of us has our own unique experiences and perspectives, and these shape how we use and understand language, right? So in that sense, language is very subjective. But at the same time, we're all part of this shared linguistic community. We learn language from others, we use it to communicate with others, and this shared use of language creates a kind of objectivity, a common ground that allows us to understand each other.
Oh, I see. So it's like language is this bridge between our inner world of subjective experience and the outer world of shared reality.
You got it. And for Hamann, this bridge isn't a one-way street. Language doesn't just reflect reality, it actively participates in creating reality.
Okay, I'm really intrigued by this, but I need a concrete example.
Mhm.
How does language actually create reality?
Well, let's take the example of a scientific discovery. Before scientists had the language to describe, say, the concept of gravity, they could observe things falling, but they didn't have a way to really understand what was happening. Once they developed the language of physics, they could not only describe the phenomenon, but also predict and control it in ways that were impossible before.
So the language of physics literally opened up a new way of seeing and interacting with the world.
Exactly. And this actually applies to all aspects of human experience. The language we use to describe our emotions, our relationships, our beliefs, all of these things shape how we experience and understand those things.
Wow, this is blowing my mind. It's like language is this hidden force that's been shaping our reality all along, and we weren't even aware of it.
And that's why Hamann was so critical of the Enlightenment's attempt to create this, purely objective, reason-based system of knowledge. He believed that any system of knowledge is ultimately grounded in language, and language is always going to be shaped by our subjective experiences and perspectives.
So there's no escaping the human element, even in our most abstract and objective pursuits.
Precisely. And for Hamann, this wasn't a bad thing. He saw the subjective, experiential dimension of language as a source of creativity, insight, and connection.
This is making me think about art and literature. Language isn't just about conveying information in those contexts. It's about creating beauty, evoking emotions, and connecting with others on a deeper level.
Exactly. Hamann saw art as this powerful example of how language can transcend its purely descriptive function and become a force for creation and connection.
So for Hamann, language wasn't just a tool. It was almost like a living entity, something that shapes and is shaped by our interactions with the world and with each other.
That's a great way to put it. And this view of language has profound implications for how we understand everything from knowledge and truth to communication and relationships.
This has been an incredibly deep dive, and I feel like I've learned so much, not just about Hamann, but about the power of language itself.
Me too. Hamann is one of those thinkers who forces you to question everything you thought you knew. And even if you don't agree with everything he says, his ideas are just so stimulating and thought-provoking.
He definitely challenges us to think differently about how we think. So, for our listeners who might be feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this, what's the one key takeaway they should walk away with?
I think the most important thing is to recognize the power of language. We often take it for granted, but Hamann reminds us that language is really the foundation of our experience of the world. It shapes how we think, how we feel, how we relate to others, and even how we understand ourselves.
So the next time you're reading a book, having a conversation, or even just thinking to yourself, pay attention to the words you're using. They might be doing more than you realize.
That's great advice. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the fascinating and challenging world of Johann Georg Hamann.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations flowing.